So it would be great to see people saying hello and showing us that they are out there. And I think I'd like, as it's now 5:30, so we should start. So this session is about dialectical critical realism. It's a follow-on session from the first session that we had on basic critical realism. I thought it might be useful to offer you a response that Roy gave during one of his reading group sessions, and it's to do with the way in which you access critical realism. Don't let yourselves get overwhelmed by it. Roy, I'm paraphrasing what he said. He suggested that the best way of dealing with dialectical critical realism is just to listen to it and return back to it. Is not to become overwhelmed by it. Take from it what you want, understand that little bit of what you want, and then come back to the next one. The work that I do, the coaching work, uses dialectical critical realism in its idea of freedom, and particularly an idea of freedom, creativity, love, and right action, which is the way in which I take my sense of understanding from dialectical critical realism. So I really suggest that you allow yourself just to hear what Ray has to say, and give yourself that moment just to enjoy what he has to say. I can see that he's there, and I'm just going to ask to make sure that Roy's got his talk switched on.
Yes,
Ready to go?
yes.
Okay, brilliant. I can hear him all there. So, thank you, Roy. Let's go. There he is. Great, Roy. Thank you for being here, Roy.
Yeah.
I'm going to hand it over to you. Cheers.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Gary, and welcome to this second session to everyone who's tuned in. And this, as I think Gary said, will be on dialectical critical realism. And now you'll remember that dialectical critical realism is the second of the three main phases of critical realism. The first phase, which we discussed last time, basic critical realism, consists of transcendental realism as a philosophy of science, critical naturalism as a philosophy of social science, and the theory of explanatory critique as a sort of proto-ethics. Then we have dialectical critical realism, and next time I'll be looking at the third phase, which is the philosophy of materiality. Now, the best way to see these three phases together is to see them as exercises in ontology, as developing the arguments that we advanced last time. So you'll remember when we began basic critical realism, we saw that it had begun with a double argument about ontology. An argument for ontology and against its reduction to epistemology, and an argument against the implicit ontology of the dominant traditions in Western philosophy. This implicit ontology we saw was actualist and was of a kind which would have made science effectively either useless or impossible. So what we're doing now is developing our ontology this week and next week to take in a deeper and more specified account of being. What we got from basic critical realism was, you might say, an idea of being as such, and an exploration of being as involving non-identity. And two particular forms of non-identity came very much to the fore: differentiation and stratification. So that was the main thrust of the ontology we developed last time. But actually, of course, we need philosophically to know much more about the world than that it's differentiated, say, between open and closed systems, and stratify, say, between generative mechanisms and structures on the one hand and events on the other, or between the domains of the real and the actual. But this deepening of ontology is what dialectical critical realism and the philosophy of materiality achieves. So what I'm going to do now is just list the 7 levels of ontology that we'll be exploring all together. The first level is a level which thinks or understands being as such and being as non-identity, and that's called 1M. The second level, 2E, explores being as process, being as involving negativity, change, and absence. The third level explores being as together, as internally related, and as a whole. The fourth level understands being as incorporating transformative praxis. So those are the 4 levels of dialectical critical realism. And then next week we'll be discussing the 3 further levels of the philosophy of materiality. The 5th level, 5A, understands being as inward, as reflexive, and as generally interior. The 6th level, called 6R, understands being as re-enchantment. The 7th level understands being as incorporating the primacy of identity over difference and unity over split, and in particular understands being as non-duality. So it's the 4 levels of dialectical critical realism that I'll be concentrating on today. And the basic critical realism has said a little bit about the first level, 1M, and a little bit about the 4th level, 4D. The philosophy of science has talked about structure and difference at 1M, and the philosophy of social science of critical realism has talked about the concepts of transformative agency and structure and so on. So we've already got some components of dialectical critical realism there. However, dialectical critical realism, which I suppose was initiated with the publication of my book, Dialectical Pulse of Freedom, in 1993, and then Plato, etc., a year later. I should probably say not initiated, but the explicit philosophy, dialectical critical realism, was initiated by those publications. It is a systematic deepening of all those 4 levels. And what I want to do is go in this first hour through the main features of those 4 levels. So I'll just repeat the 4 levels for you. 1M understands being as such and being as non-identity. So this is starting off from where basic critical realism starts off, but is deepened, as we've seen. Then 2E involves being as process, as incorporating change and negativity. 3L involves being as internally related, and as a whole. And 4D thematizes being as incorporating transformative praxis. So let's start with 1A. Almost all the distinctions of almost all the developments recorded in basic critical realism involve relations of non-identity. And that's why it's a key feature of 1M. So we say that the transitive and the intransitive dimensions are distinct. That ontology is something which isn't the same as epistemology. It can't be reduced to it. The domain of the real, talking about causal laws and fields and structures, can't be reduced to, i.e. isn't the same as patterns of events. Patterns of events aren't the same as our experiences. So we have the differences between the domains of the real, the actual, and the empirical. But in the corpus of dialectical critical realism, we move on quite a bit further. Two very general points about ontology need to be noted. The first, that ontology is explicitly thematized as all-inclusive. So ontology includes knowledge. It includes epistemology, but it includes also error and illusion. An illusion can have a causal effect. And we say that in general, anything that has a causal effect or causal power is real. So ontology will include mathematical mistakes, for instance. Ontology is all-inclusive. And then ontology is also inexorable, because there's no way you can't do ontology. If you give an account of knowledge or an account of language, then you are implicitly giving an account of the world known in knowledge or spoken about in the language. So you can't help but do ontology. Then we specify particular objects, topics, that need a realist analysis. So we have dispositional realism. This is the idea that possibilities are real, not just actualities. If we have an actuality, something that's happened, then the possibility it actualizes or realizes must also be real. And in general, that possibility, it sits along with possibilities of different things. So the idea that another world is possible, or a better world, or the idea that we can consciously move towards it, all these are things which are situated by dispositional realism, which becomes very important in what they call concrete utopianism. Then another form of realism, all of these realisms are implied by and necessary for the dialectical development, the full development of transcendental realism. Another form of realism is categorical realism, which is the idea that the categories the objects that philosophers have liked to talk about, like causality, law, they themselves are real. They're not, as Kant and Popper, for instance, would have them, subjective impositions that we put on the world. Rather, they're in reality itself. So the world contains not only lots of different causal laws, it contains causality, law, etc. as such. A very important extension of realism here comes in the theory of meaning. And the crucial concept here is the semiotic triangle. The semiotic triangle is a triangle with its three apexes constituted by the signifier, which is the word or symbol, the signified, which is the meaning and or concept, and thirdly, the reference, which is the object to which the signifier refers. Typically in Saussurian and post-Saussurian semiotics, analysis of meaning and language, the reference is dropped. So we just have a relationship between the signifier and the signified. In fact, it can be a very complex relationship of the sort that someone like Derrida will analyze, but there is no reference there. And without a reference, the whole point of language, which is to enable us to more coherently steer our way around the world, is lost. I should just add that the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American tradition in linguistics has often made the opposite mistake of assuming a simple relationship between signifier and reference, so that the signified, the concept, the meaning, gets lost. We need to clearly situate language in a world which exists in large part independently of the uses of that language, and so situated in the context of the semiotic triangle, and a world in which language has, in which things have become referentially detached from the language we use to describe it. So that's the important concept of referential detachment. And then we have here an elitic realism, a realism about truth. VCR argues that philosophers have had a too simple concept of truth. And actually what is involved in the concept of truth are four distinct components. And the first, I'll just run through these components. The first component could be called the fiduciary component. This is the sense of truth, which is involved when you say, this is true, and you mean, trust me, take my word for it. This is truth as a social bond. Then there is secondly the warrantedly assertable, evidential sense of truth. This is a sense in which we say that something is true when we have sufficient evidence to assert it in a scientific context, say. And that, of course, is the concept of truth that most philosophers have concentrated on. But then thirdly, there's a very interesting sense or concept of truth, which I call the expressive referential. This is the sense in which the grass is green, perfectly expresses the greenness of grass. And we can understand the grass is green as straddling the ontic epistemic divide. And then the fourth sense of truth is a genuinely fully ontological sense of truth, in which I might want to say something like the truth of the fact that water boils at 100 degrees centigrade lies in its molecular constitution. In other words, there I'm saying the truth of what happens at one level of reality is the structure that produces it at a higher order of reality. And ontological stratification and dialectic truth sit side by side. Another important concept which is given a realist interpretation in DCR is that of a Tina formation. A Tina formation occurs when a falsity in theory is combined with a truth in practice. And the sort of thing I'm thinking of here, for example, could be illustrated by the way in which chemists and physicists observe in practice a distinction between open and closed systems. They do not regard the open systemic world as falsifying their experimentally generated results. At the same time, they feel that they can use the results of careful experimental work to make statements about how the world is going on transfactually, quite independently of the closure or otherwise of the systems. And you wouldn't be a chemist, you wouldn't be a physicist unless you observe that distinction in practice. But of course, for many chemists, that will sit very uneasily with the empirical realist, perhaps empiricist, positivist theory they adopt. And so there'll be this uneasy compromise formation in which they carry on successfully doing the right thing, but can't think why it is the right thing. So that you have this theory-practice inconsistency. And the Tina formation is the typical mechanism in which the illusions and ideological errors under which we live is reproduced. Then, finally, I want to point to a basic logic which is brought out clearly, can be brought out clearly here at 1M. And this is the logic of emancipatory discourse. Because when you say that you want to be free in what you are, I'll just rephrase that. It may not be you who says it. Maybe when a theory is articulating the possibilities of freedom, what it will be often typically doing is positing a basic level of human being, which is okay, which sustains another level which has become emergent from it, which is acting as a constraint. Thus, you might have human capacity to labour being constrained in Marxist theory by the existence of class relations. And the argument is that at a certain point the capacities to labour will break free, throw off the level which is emergent and sitting on it and bettering those basic human productive forces. So that's a very familiar pattern. There's a level of human being and activity which is all right, which is productive, which contributes to human happiness. And then there's another level which is bettering it. And this other level is emergent from the more basic level, and what is required is for it to be shed. What is required is an act of disemergence. And there's an ontological asymmetry here, because the argument of the person committed to the logic of emancipatory discourse would be that we can't have a society in which human beings don't create, are not productive, but we can have a society without exploitative class relations or whatever. So those are some of the developments under 1M. Now, at 2E, which is probably within dialectical critical realism, this is the most important of the levels, and it's the level which requires a new or a considerably developed philosophical system. So let's focus on the concept of change. When you say that something changes, what you're saying is that something which was there has passed out of existence, and or something that wasn't there has come into being. In either case, you're involved with negativity and with absence, with the disappearance of what was, or the appearance from what wasn't of something new. So this is our normal, everyday understanding of change. And this was pronounced by Parmenides in ancient Greek times as being absolutely wrong. He said, in effect, you cannot have change in the real world. And this, of course, is a striking doctrine, because it seems obvious that there appears to be change. Now, his doctrine of what I call ontological monovalence, prohibiting ontological change, has proved profoundly important. And ontological monovalence, together with the epistemic fallacy and actualism, are the three unholy errors of Western philosophy. If Parmenides had just left it at that, of course, and no one had followed up, it might have been regarded as a wild, typically philosophical statement. And it's due to Plato that this Parmenidean idea received doctrine. And what Plato did was he analyzed apparent change in terms of difference. And in a substantive scientific way, this was supported by an idea that what happened when something seemed to change was not really change, but just a redistribution of unchanging parts. So these unchanging parts might be forms in Plato, or they might be atoms in atomism. Now, this idea that you can understand change along the lines of difference, of course, denies the difference between saying that Sophie's hair color on Tuesday is different from Sophie's hair color today, and saying that Sophie dyed her hair. Sophie changed the color of her hair, or the color of her hair changed. Because what's involved in the talking about change is the idea of an underlying continuum, a substance which remains unchanged, which underwent the transformation. And this may not be simply a substance, it can be a region of space or time. So that one can say that the difference between saying that in this cafe we have Sartre and we don't have Pierre, and saying that in this cafe Sartre greeted the arrival of Pierre is understood in terms of a change in the space, namely the arrival of Pierre. So the analysis of change that DCR puts forward is consistent with our ordinary concept of change, and involves a view in which the cosmos, in which we see emergence or the production of new things as being a vital feature. Now, how would you convince yourself that the DCR analysis was right? Well, one way of doing it is to think about ontological change and epistemological change, and then you can see there's a difference between me saying that it's started to rain in Manchester, which is about Manchester, and my saying Jack believes that it rains in Manchester, or it is correct to say that it is raining in Manchester. In one case, the absenting, the negation is in the world itself, and in the other case is in our descriptions of the world. And for DCR, we can have change, and we do have change at both levels. And of course, unless epistemic change was also ontological change, we wouldn't have language, belief, and knowledge in the world itself as properties of the world. So for DCR, absence is a key concept. And what DCR puts at the center of our attention is the idea of determinate absences. So it's not concerned with nothingness, indeterminate absence. It's concerned with things like the absence of rain, or some concrete instance of something not happening, which has a causal effect, and which we need to take account of in our understanding of reality. So now I want to say a little bit about a 2E notion, which many are very mystified about, namely the idea of dialectic. And I can do it, I can start it rather best by going back to Marx's famous reception of Hegel's dialectic. You remember that he wrote to Engels that Hegel has discovered the secret of all knowledge, the scientific method, in his elucidation of in his dialectic, he remarked to Engels that if only he had a bit more time, he'd like nothing better than to write a couple of printer's sheets explaining what this secret of the scientific method was. Well, it's very unfortunate he didn't do this, and many other people since then have tried to explain what they consider the secret of dialectic is. There was one gentleman in the 19th century who wrote a book called The Secret of Hegel, and after 300 or 400 pages, one could say the reader would be no wiser as to what this was. Well, actually, I think that dialectic is a complex concept, and there are many different kinds of dialectics, which in DCR I try and diffract, separate out, and reconstruct. But it's quite clear that there's one kind of dialectic which is the one which excited Marx. I think DCR can give a very simple and plausible explanation of this. So let's go back to science. And you remember Kuhn's description of science in terms of normal science, in which the scientist who's a neophyte, who's being trained, is tested, and then revolutionary science, in which concepts are being radically transformed. So I think it's possible to give a very simple dialectical critical realist reconstruction of these different phases of science. So any theory we'll try and describe all the causally relevant factors are impinging on the result that it's describing. Now, very often, and in fact you could say it's pretty much always going to be the case, that the scientists will not succeed in doing that. So that although the attempt has been made to describe a whole field, something causally relevant has been left out. And sooner or later, the causally relevant thing which has been left out will exact its toll on the theory. The incompleteness will generate inconsistencies and contradictions, which will appear to the theorists as a signaling device that they've left something out. And of course, what they've left out very often in science is something they didn't know about. And so what this situation of tremendous contradiction yields a pre-revolutionary situation, revolutionary situation, in which a new concept has to be there to restore scientific equilibrium. And from a realist standpoint, meta standpoint, that means that something new has to be discovered about the world. That you have to discover what it is that you've left out. And of course, in Newton's case, it was gravity. When Einstein was formulating special theory of relativity, it was that was what he discovered. And after the discovery, then consistency in the conceptual field can be restored. Thus, there is a simple way of describing a dialectic of scientific knowledge in which an absence or an incompleteness in the theory leads to contradictions and other aporia or problems which proliferate, necessitating the discovery of what it is that has been left out, and that is a scientific breakthrough or a scientific revolution. So this is a very simple and plausible process that occurs in science. Could we say something more general might occur in society? Well, in the couple of decades before the First World War, in the 19th century, we had the phenomenon of the suffragette movement. And what was the suffragette movement about? It was about a huge incompleteness, absence in the political field, that women could not vote. And in the course of those decades, and a decade or so after it, women in the Western world, at least, were granted the suffrage. So that what had happened is the political totality had been transformed to be a more inclusive one. The absence had been remedied or rectified. Then, of course, there was a problem for many countries in the Western world in the 20s and 30s, and particularly the colonial powers in Europe, that they were the masters of colonial peoples who were denied their own democratic rights and denied the right to be self-determining in respect of their own countries. And again, you can see how this necessitated a response to this challenge, and of course all the pressures that it brought to bear, that were brought to bear on the political setup in those powers, and until you had a state of decolonization. And then, of course, the argument can be taken further. You could argue, was this decolonization real or purely formal? And then you can take the argument into the field of democracy. We can say, okay, we have the vote, but how responsive are our political leaders to our needs and wants and best interests? And wouldn't there be a way of improving the democracy we have? And so the argument continues. What's important to note here is that there is a clear mechanism in such a dialectical process, a clear learning mechanism in which our response to a social situation or problem field moves in a negentropic way, that moves to increasing order. And that negentropy is brought out and has its origin perhaps in Hegel's, or it's not perhaps origin, but it's is very well stated in by Hegel. And we can now make sense of the Marxist metaphor, the rational kernel and the mystical shell, and say the rational kernel of a dialectic, at least that kind of epistemological learning dialectic, is the remedying of incompleteness or absence by building greater, more inclusive, more comprehensive totality of theoretical or social whole. There's quite a lot more that could be said about dialectic, but I'm beginning to run short of time, so I won't say it here. Hope only that you've had enough to whet your appetite to read it in the DCR text. But there's another TUI concept that's very important to note, and that is in TUI we theorize in a critical realist way space, time, and tense. And in particular, a useful concept is that of a rhythmic, which is a spatio-temporalizing causal process. And what is intimated by this concept is the tri-unity and irreducibility of geography, history, and social theory. The concept of the past and the future are also given deeper readings. And if you just look around the room you're in, you'll note where the furniture comes from, and when roughly the house or building that you're in was constructed. And then you'll think about what you're talking about, and you're talking about philosophical ideas which have been long handed down, like actualism, like ontological monovalence. And we can say that to a large extent we are living in the presence of the past. Not so much time for 3L and 4D. 3L is very important. It's the level in which we explore not taking things extensively, not regarding things as atomistic and on their own, but as together. That what I'm saying now has to be taken with what I said last week and your questions. And this particular sentence has to be related to the sentence before it. So they can't be taken alone. They don't make sense alone. So if you think about relations in a family, then you get a good sense of what one means by internal relations. Some social relations and a lot of natural relations are external. The difference to this cup of tea, this cup of tea does not make any difference to what's inside that bottle of water. So that is an external relation. But my sitting here and talking to you is internally related to your interests and presence. So the idea of an internal relation is the arch idea in 3L. And clearly we can move from taking things together to taking things as a whole, as a totality. And in the social world, most totalities are partial totalities. That's their totality shot through by external relations as well as internal relations. The concept of holistic causality is tremendously important, and we'll all be aware of this intuitively. It's the idea of a set of component parts, all of which interact so as to produce a whole, and a whole which in turn produces, has an effect on the component parts, so that you have a complex of continuing the interaction between parts and parts, parts and whole and parts. A very important concept at 3L is that of a concrete universal. Now, most of the universals that Western philosophy talks about are abstract universals. And the idea here is that what you can say meaningfully and scientifically about something, you should be able to say about all instances of that thing. So what I can say about a pen at a scientific or meaningful level, I should be able to say about all pens. Now, of course, that breaks down in the real world, and I don't know of a single abstract universal. If you take something which is universal, like a human being, you'll find that the human beings are all very different. So each human being will have what we call mediations. These will specify its sex or gender, its occupation, whether it's parents, children, brothers, sisters, whether it's a fan of the Rolling Stones or whatever. Those are its mediations. Then supposing we're now focusing on two women who have exactly the same mediations, then these two women will themselves differ by having a different space-time path. One will be 35 and born in Goa, the other will be 70 and born in Timbuktu. So that is the specific geohistorical trajectory of the particular instruments of the universal. And then suppose we had two women who had exactly the same mediations and exactly the same geohistorical trajectory. They would nevertheless still be irreducibly different. They would have an irreducible uniqueness to them. They would be what we call concrete singularities. So the theory of the concrete universal, concrete singular, is an important way in which dialectical critical realism makes it possible to identify real historical, geohistorical individuals and talk about them. Finally, I should note here the useful concept of a constellation. We can think of, I said earlier, that knowledge is also part of being. So we can think of epistemology and knowledge as being contained or overreached by being. And at the same time, the knowledge will always have a specific intransitive object. That is, a specific part of being will be what the knowledge is about. So in this way, through this kind of figure of constellational overreaching and containment, we can do justice to the sense in which ontology or being includes everything, and including epistemology and knowledge, and the sense in which knowledge and epistemology have specific intransitive objects. Very briefly on 4D. VCR starts off by noticing the irreducibility of agency. There is no way you can not act. If you decide not to act, that is itself a form of action. But when you think about it, there's no way you cannot intend. Intentionality is irreducible. And then, if you think about it, spontaneity, or an immediate manifestation of thought in action, is irreducible. At a certain point, thought becomes action. Must be an element of spontaneity, or, as I'll talk about next time, non-duality, for agency to be possible at all. we saw last time how the concept of how the transformational model of social activity, which specifies the relations between structure and agency, needs to be expanded to the concept of four-planar social being. And this is the idea that everything that occurs in society and social world occurs simultaneously at four different levels. The level of material transactions with nature, the level of social interactions between people, the level of social structure, and the level of the stratification of the embodied personality. Now, one of the problems that the left in particular has to face is that projects oriented to social change have in general only been directed to a transformation in social structure, whereas to change our social life, to change society, we need to operate on all four levels. By the same token, it can be said that the right generally has restricted itself to, or tendencies within it, to self-improvement, to improving the improvements of the level of the stratification of the embodied personality. Of course, we need action on all these fronts for genuine social change to occur. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop there, and I'll round this exposition of DCR off with some brief remarks after the break on ethics, DCR ethics, and the DCR metacritique of Western philosophy. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Roy, and I'm quite pleased that you spoke about change, because I know for myself we have a constant conversation about change and difference. That'll help us with our conversation. The chat room's open, so if you would like to leave any questions